Hello and welcome to my new video for AQA Religious Studies A. As you'll see, this latest video is on Buddhism and beliefs and teachings. So I've got to apologise from 2 points of view. First of all, I've got to apologise if Buddhism isn't one of the comparative religions that you're studying. Secondly, I apologise to any Buddhists or Buddhist scholars out there who are going to wince at my pronunciations. But anyway, let's move on. Okay, so Buddhism is quite an old religion. It predates Christianity by about 500 years. As most of you will know from your studies, it was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who, having become enlightened, became known as the Buddha. As a young man, Siddhartha led a life of luxury. He was brought up in a palace, and he was isolated from the outside world and its suffering, predominantly because his father feared that he would become a holy man, which obviously he did. The other thing to say about it is that it doesn't have the same global spread as Christianity. Although there are Buddhists all around the world, the majority of those Buddhists are based within sort of Asia and Southeast Asia. Okay, so I've already mentioned that Siddhartha Gautama grew up in a palace. You can read the sort of backstory about that. I'm sure you are aware of it. But basically, the story goes that having grown up in a palace, he left the palace at the age of 29, and in a single encounter or a series of encounters, we're not quite sure, he saw the four sights. And those sights are old age, illness, death, and a holy man. Now, all of those sights had a profound influence on Siddhartha, and as I say, he decided ultimately that he would reject the life that he had previously led, and that he would leave the palace and renounce all his worldly goods. Okay, so after leaving the palace and he's left behind his family, he's got a wife and a young child, he decides that he is going to become a holy man, and he decides that the best way of going about this is to lead what's known as an ascetic life. Be careful not to confuse ascetic with aesthetic, they're two different things. But basically, this is a life where he rejects all worldly goods and he leads a kind of life of spiritual purity, and it's quite a difficult and extreme way of life to pursue. But anyway, he also decides to practice meditation. Now, during the course of this sort of process that he's going through, he discovers that this life of denial and extreme suffering is not very good for you. It nearly leads to his death. So what he does is he undergoes a period of re-evaluation, and thinks about what would cause an end to the suffering that he has previously observed. And he concludes that you should follow what's known as the middle way. Now, we'll get on to talking about that later on, but obviously you need to be aware that the middle way is a central aspect of the Buddha's teachings. Okay, so having adopted this middle way, Siddhartha practices meditation. Again, meditation is a key feature of Buddhism, of which I'm sure you're very much aware. He sees this as a way of attaining the wisdom of enlightenment. Now, enlightenment means that he obviously overcomes the barriers to seeing the world as it actually is, and during the process of enlightenment, he gains that insight into the world, how it is, and obviously, the role of suffering, etc., within that world. During this period of kind of intense meditation, we're told that the Buddha is visited by Mara, an evil demon who attempts to stop him achieving enlightenment. However, he kind of is able to reject those attempts. And again, you might want to look at sort of comparisons with Jesus being tempted by the devil when he's in the wilderness, but I'll leave that to you. So Siddhartha becomes enlightened over 3 different periods, and these are called the 3 watches of the night. During these 3 different periods, he becomes aware of not only his past lives, but the cycle of life and death and the cause of suffering. And following that, he becomes the Buddha. He gains his enlightenment, and he's joined by those people that he has previously meditated with. They're called the 5 ascetics, and they are followers of the Buddha, his first 5 followers, if you like, disciples. Okay, so following his enlightenment, the Buddha taught about the nature of existence. These are sometimes regarded as kind of universal truths or laws. Now, in an ancient language, Pali, they're known as the Dharma, and in Sanskrit, similarly pronounced rather, but slightly different spelt. So Dharma. In short, these are the Buddha's teachings. Now, I'm afraid to say there's no real way of getting around it, but you're going to have to learn words which are going to be quite unfamiliar. The only way of really learning these is by kind of repetition and using them. Unfortunately, as I say, there is no easy way of remembering them, and I know that students tend to sort of struggle with them. So the Dharma are the second of the 3 refuges. They're also called treasures and jewels. Of the 3, the first is the Buddha, and the third is the Buddhist community, or what's known as Sangha. Right, so one of the Buddha's ideas is that of dependent arising, and it's the Buddhist vision of the nature of life. It basically states that things are dependent on one another. Now, again, you're going to have to try and remember what these concepts look like. So, in this regard, I would suggest that a school, for example, my school, Nicholas Chamberlain, basically is only a school because it's dependent on having students, and it's also dependent on having teachers. If either of those didn't exist, then it wouldn't be a school. You can also see this in the Tibetan wheel of life. This process is shown in a cycle of life and death called samsara. In this case, the world in which people are reborn depends on their actions or karma. And for Buddhists, the goal is to try to break out of this cycle and to achieve nirvana. Now, again, you'll see these words. I'm using the version of these words which is used in the GCSE textbook that we have. Again, you might find that they are slightly differently spelt in the books that you used, but be aware of them and try not to get them confused with other similar sounding words which belong to other religions. Okay, so in Buddhism, there are 3 characteristics that mark our lives. The first of these marks is something called dukkha, or suffering. And for Buddhists, suffering can be seen in 3 ways. There's the kind of conventional idea of suffering, which is pain and discomfort. You're ill, you don't feel too happy about it. That's one version of suffering. The second is change, and that's could be things like, I don't know, a change in your life circumstances, or, something like moving from one school to another and leaving all your friends behind. The third is attachment. Now, on the face of it, it would seem that might be attachment to a particular object, a person, etc. However, it seems in Buddhism to be slightly more complicated than that, and is basically a kind of general dissatisfaction with life, of which kind of attachment to objects, people, etc. Could be part of that and could cause suffering. Okay, the second mark is something called anicca, or impermanence. Basically, the Buddha teaches that we want stability in our lives. We like to think that we have stable lives, but we also have to accept that there's an ever-changing world. And when we realize that we can't have stability in this changing world, that things move on, things change, etc., that in itself becomes a cause of suffering. The third mark is that of anatta, or basically there's no fixed self or soul. Now, Buddhists think that human beings are comprised of what's known as 5 aggregates, bits and pieces that make us who we are. And these are form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. As people, we're basically constantly changing. We might have an identity, but this isn't fixed. And again, you might want to think about your own life and how you as a small child are very different from now, from you as now, being teenagers. And are you the same person? Well, yes. And at the same time, no, you're obviously very different from when you were 3 or 4. So again, some sort of concepts for you to think about. Okay, so one of the most important thing within Buddhism is this thing called the Four Noble Truths, and these are seen as the kind of core elements of Buddha's teachings. Now, we're going to also, as we have done in Christianity, encounter 2 kind of major groups within Buddhism. I'm going to talk about those in a little more detail, but the first group is Theravada Buddhists, who understand that the 4 truths are a key to gaining enlightenment. And our Theravada Buddhists are your kind of more traditional Buddhists. I don't want to do it, but I guess if we were to draw a comparison, we might sort of say they are kind of like, the sort of more traditional Buddhists that we might find a comparison with, I don't know, in Catholics and Christianity. On the other hand, there are Mahayana Buddhists. There again, pronunciations let me down. But basically, they believe that the 4 Noble Truths are important, but there also has to be an emphasis on other teachings, for example, compassion. Now, you'll need to know the distinction between those 2 Buddhist groups. So that's something which you will have to go back and look at and understand in quite some detail. Okay, so we've already looked at dukkha and the acceptance that suffering exists. So the second noble truth is something called tanha, or cravings. Buddha describes 3 types of different cravings that human beings have. Cravings for things that please the senses. For example, you might have a craving for chocolate. Do you need chocolate? The answer is no, but you have a craving for it because that's what you desire at that particular moment in time. Craving to become something that you are not. So every Saturday we're faced with people appearing on shows like The X Factor, who are obviously craving fame and fortune, and then disappointed when they realise they've got no talent. And then craving for non-existence. Now, craving for non-existence might sound a bit weird, but it's craving for things. So, for example, I don't know, you might have done something which has embarrassed you in front of your friends, and you wish that moment could go away and never happened. So there are 3 types of craving. In addition to these, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are also 3 poisons that cause suffering. There's a little picture on the screen which you can see, and they denote these 3 poisons. So there's ignorance, which is pictured as a pig, greed and desire, which is a cockerel, and anger and hatred, which is a snake. Okay, so in general terms, the end goal of Buddhism is that basically you should be able to overcome suffering. And the Buddha teaches that you can overcome suffering by letting go of craving things. Now, as I say, we go back to the middle path here. It doesn't mean to say that you should stop craving things. Buddha recognizes that you might want things. I mean, in this case, you might want a new phone, although I'm pretty sure Buddha wasn't aware of mobile phones. Now, the one thing you should do is enjoy it and accept that it will not last. Think about that, in terms of craving. And again, I think it's an interesting concept, because how many of us want a new mobile phone, receive a new mobile phone, only to be told that there's another version coming along and we want that? Basically, mobile phone companies, business is perpetuated by cravings for the latest sort of, mobile phone. The Buddha also says that you should understand that some things offer deeper satisfaction. So, things like craving a mobile phone, you might get enjoyment from that mobile phone, but you would get far deeper satisfaction from, say, a meaningful friendship or relationship. Okay, so one of the key things that Buddhists aim towards is gaining nibbana or nirvana. Basically, a Buddha or enlightened being has, by attaining nibbana or nirvana, extinguished the flame of the three poisons or the causes of greed and craving. So they've kind of overcome that greed, that craving, etc. And because of that, they're able to enter this state of nibbana, or as I say, nirvana, either spelling will do. Okay, now Buddhism is quite a practical religion, if we want to call it that, and it suggests a cure for suffering, basically the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path provides a series of ways in which Buddhists should behave in order to overcome suffering and ultimately to achieve enlightenment. These practices are often grouped into three categories called the Threefold Way. So there's a kind of 8 characteristics that you adopt, and those are subdivided into 3 categories. And the 3 categories are ethics, so basically how you should behave, meditation, and wisdom. And you can see from the diagram what they are. So having the right mindfulness, right intention, right speech, right action, etc. Again, you might want to remember those, or try to remember at least some of them, just in case they come up within the exam. Okay, now I previously stated that there were different groups within the Buddhist tradition. Buddhism is the same as most major religions, in the sense that kind of, over time, groups have splintered off and have created their own kind of traditions. The first of these is Theravada Buddhism. It's one of the oldest schools of Buddhism and considered a rather kind of traditional form of Buddhism. It's mainly practiced in Southeast Asia, so countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar. In terms of its monastic tradition, we'll look at that in my video, which I'll do at some point on Buddhist practices. But its monastic tradition, basically the monks, it focuses on meditation and following rules such as not owning anything, not having sexual relationships, and not offending anyone. Now, women can be ordained as priests, although that seemingly is dying out within this tradition, and some people within the tradition would suggest that it is only men who can gain enlightenment, so that if you want to gain enlightenment, you have to be reborn as a man. But as I say, we'll have a look at that when I make a video on Buddhist practices. In contrast, there's the Mahayana tradition. I think I might have said it right, but who knows? That basically represents a number of different groups. So you can see some Zen Buddhist monks, and they are part of that tradition. Unlike Theravada Buddhists, who regard the Buddha as a historical figure, Mahayana Buddhists believe he continues to interact with the world and appears in visions and through meditation, etc. Mahayana Buddhists basically place an emphasis on something called sunyata, or the concept that everything is interdependent. They also believe that in the concepts of something called Buddhahood and Buddha nature. Basically, those two concepts suggest that everyone has the potential to be a Buddha inside them, remembering that there is the Buddha that we talk about and Buddha, which is an enlightened state. So you have the potential, everyone has the potential within them to gain a state of enlightenment and to gain something, as I say, called Buddhahood. Right, now there are two particular kind of aspects that you need to be aware of. Again, I think this might have come up the exam this year, and then this year I'm talking about 2018, which are in Theravada Buddhism, there is something called an Arhat. An Arhat is basically a perfected person who's achieved enlightenment. That's something that all good Buddhists should be aiming towards. In contrast, Mahayana Buddhists see Arhats as someone who's on the path to enlightenment but hasn't quite gained enlightenment. Instead, for Mahayana Buddhists, the ideal is to become a Bodhisattva. That's basically an enlightened person who decides to remain in the cycle of samsara, the cycle of life and death, basically in order to help others. And they do so by focusing on the six perfections, things like compassion, etc. Haven't put the six perfections here. Again, you might want to read about the six perfections and learn those, but there is an awful lot of content here that you've got to learn, and as I say, some concepts which might not necessarily be too familiar to you. Okay, the last form of Buddhism that I'm going to talk about is Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism is, again, part of the Mahayana tradition and is the most popular form of Buddhism in Japan. It's based on faith in what's known as the Amitabha Buddha. Remember, Buddha means enlightened one. So we talk about the Buddha, but other religious people have the potential of becoming a Buddha. Basically, Amitabha Buddha is a king who rejected his worldly goods and decided to become a monk. And in doing so, he created a paradise or pure land called Sukhavati. By gaining entry to Sukhavati, Pure Land Buddhists believe that they will be taught by the Amitabha Buddha directly, and as a consequence, it then becomes far easier to gain enlightenment. It's quite interesting because this is very distinct from other forms of Buddhism, because instead of focusing attention on your behavior and conduct, there's a focus on having faith in the Amitabha Buddha. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to think that because that involves faith rather than personal conduct, quite a lot of people prefer it because it allows you to escape your behavior and actions and focus on something else rather than your own behavior. Okay, so hopefully what I've done is I have given you an overview of Buddhist beliefs. I hope that this has proven to be useful, and obviously my next videos will be on Buddhist practices.